The true story of Typhoid Mary is way sadder than you think. Germ theory was a fairly new notion during the early 1900s, and even doctors at the time had no idea how diseases were spread. The medical knowledge at the time was still poor, and so the impacts of bacterial diseases such as typhoid and dysentery could kill an entire family. The famous story of Mary Mallon is of an Irish immigrant who was employed as a cook for rich New York families, who was captured for being a super spreader and subjected to a number of inhumane attempts at surgery to remove infected body parts and many procedures against her will. She was known as a super spreader, which earned her the famous name Typhoid Mary. She left a string of unwell people in her tracks. By the time Mary had infected at least 22 people, doctors were becoming savvy in their knowledge that the disease was most likely spread through human waste. From this, they were able to track the outbreaks back by locating the start of an epidemic and following its spread. Doctors set about putting her into quarantine in 1907 to stop her from infecting more people. But she had already infected 22 people and caused the death of one little girl. She would later be quarantined permanently and kept away from the public after she infected at least 51 people. 3 of these died from the illness. It was mind-boggling at the time that someone could be a carrier but show no symptoms themselves, and so she refused to believe that she, a healthy, middle-aged woman, could possibly be the culprit behind the disease's spread. New York health officials at the time traced the super spreading of the disease back to Mallon, the healthy woman who was asymptomatic. This instilled fear into other New Yorkers who were afraid that they could also be forced into a life of quarantine despite showing no symptoms. She often gained the public's empathy towards the situation she faced, but she was quarantined on North Brother Island after numerous fights and blatant refusals anyway. The battle between the state and Mary took almost a decade to resolve, as she tried to avoid authorities for as long as possible. Typhoid fever at the time was known as a poor man's disease, and so the health officials were taken by surprise at the number of wealthy upper-middle-class families in New York that were falling ill to the disease. Typhoid was typically associated with poverty and poor hygiene. When she was first questioned, she admitted that she did not wash her hands because she didn't see any point. There was little knowledge that germs could be spread through your hands, and she didn't seem to believe that sickness could be transferred through physical contact or lack of proper washing. George Soper, a sanitary engineer for the New York Department of Health, was hired in 1906 by one of the rich homeowners that she had made ill after his family suffered a violent and inexplicable typhoid outbreak. The engineer was first drawn to checking the servants and cooks because typhoid was associated with those of little wealth. Mary caught his attention as she was quite new at the household and had only been working for 3 weeks before the outbreak. This would later be discovered as the exact incubation period of the Salmonella bacteria that causes typhoid. It didn't take long to put 2 and 2 together and get 4 when he traced back her previous work history, only to discover a trail of other victims, job changes and new names. He was certain on this woman being the spreader. Typhoid sufferers would show symptoms between 1 to 3 weeks after infection, usually starting with a hazardously high fever, as well as nausea, vomiting, headaches and muscle pain. Next, a distinctive rash appears on the chest, Without treatment, intestinal bleeding can occur, leading to blood clots under the skin. In the most dangerous of cases, the abdomen will distend, and it will lead to their deaths. Mallon was the first person to be proven to be an asymptomatic carrier of typhoid. This meant that she carried the disease without showing any of the symptoms. This was a breakthrough, unearthing at the time, but regrettably, there was no formal protocol to follow in this situation, which led to many errors being made. Health authorities did have the right to quarantine people who posed a risk to society health-wise. However, even though authorities knew that Mallon was somehow the missing link in the typhoid outbreaks, they couldn't exactly prove how or why. The renowned Dr. George Soper, was a sanitary engineer that traced the typhoid disease back to Mallon. He tried to access samples from her in 1907. He could not get her to consent, but he didn't stop pushing her, and so she lost it and chased him out of the house with a meat cleaver. This would be the first of many attempts to gain samples from Mallon. Many involved hours-long chases before they could pin her down for a sample. Once they were able to gain her samples of stool, urine and tissue under duress, they were able to prove that she was absolutely riddled with typhoid bacteria. She was a well woman with no symptoms, but she was a menace to society and a threat to public health. Public health officials decided that she must be quarantined against her will immediately. She was forced to quarantine away from society on North Brother Island and placed in a single occupancy cottage at the Riverside Hospital. Mallon never believed that she was a typhoid carrier, and she would tell reporters that she was being unfairly treated like a leper despite being a well and normal woman. She was treated inhumanely by officials who were able to gain access to 160 samples against her consent. Doctors had no idea how to deal with a case such as hers, and so they perhaps went about her capture and treatment in all of the wrong ways. During the initial investigation of her samples, they discovered that her gallbladder was absolutely riddled with the salmonella bacteria. Their intention was to remove it as a result. As you can imagine, this would have been terrifying. She was able to resist enough to avoid getting the surgery done, but she was not able to refuse or resist them gaining access to 160 samples from her body during her years in permanent quarantine. She was treated as a lab rat during her stay at the quarantine facility, and interns and journalists treated her as a specimen, not a human. Her doctors limited her interactions and only allowed her to wash using bottles in the laboratory. Mallon was still not convinced of her superspreader name, and so she changed her name every time she went to work for a new family. But every time she worked for a new family, the people around her would become infected and a new outbreak began. Mallon was released in 1910 into society. Her only condition was that she must not continue to work as a cook. However, it didn't take long for her to break this promise. When she first left, she worked as a laundress, but she didn't stay there for long before returning to work for rich families as a cook. She moved from family to family, changing her name each time in order to escape the prying eyes of the public authorities, but she left a wake of outbreaks in her path. This went on for 5 years, until 1915, when she infected 25 people at Sloan Maternity Hospital in New York. Mallon was found working as a cook there, and she was promptly arrested and returned to quarantine. Her second quarantine was a life sentence, after she had made it very clear that she couldn't be trusted. Mallon was returned to North Brother Island in 1915, and New York public health officials decided she would remain under quarantine for the rest of her life. Typhoid Mary was one of the most dangerous women in America. She did not accept responsibility for her actions, and she could therefore not be trusted to protect the public from her super-spreading status. She lived on the island for a further 23 years before dying of suspected pneumonia in 1938. She has been thought to have infected 51 people and causing the deaths of 3. It took until 2013 for researchers to prove and show how Mallon was able to carry the bacteria but display no symptoms. The salmonella bacteria behind typhoid can hide in immune cells and basically hijack their metabolism in their favour. If the germs are successful in hacking the cells, then the carrier can spread the germ unknowingly while remaining healthy themselves. Mallon was not the only one at the time spreading the disease asymptomatically. By the time of Mallon's death in 1938, over 400 other healthy carriers had been identified. None of the other 400 carriers that were found were ever treated with the same inhumane treatment that Mary was subjected to. Her treatment was controversial, and there were arguments for both sides. Many questioned whether it was justified to protect society, and that her behaviour and refusal to cooperate was why she had such a rough time. In the early 1900s, typhoid was still a dangerous disease. The mortality rate was around 10%. A doctor introduced the first vaccine in 1896, which helped greatly for soldiers who were dying most often of typhoid than combat.